Gianna, you got the recording. Perfect.
Yep, I've got the recording and I'm just going to mute the participants while you kick off, Maria.
Awesome. But we'll unmute you right after, of course. This is going to be an interactive kind of course, not a boring webinar. All right. Welcome, everyone. Happy New Year. I feel like this is our first society event, Gianna. Am I wrong? Of 2021? Yeah, this is and it's quite an accomplishment on our end, because when we were first dreaming about the society, we dreamt of a world where we could develop courses and help our community and fellow cybersecurity marketers with amazing content and educational resources. So here it is, the dream has come true and we couldn't be more excited. So welcome to the first ever Cybersecurity Marketing Society member exclusive course, in partnership with our friends at W2 Communications, who put together an amazing 3-course workshop on PR in cybersecurity, of course, unveiling the trade secrets from seasoned PR professionals in our sector. So today, for the inaugural course, the students, which are you and us, Gianna and I too, will learn basically how to define a target audience, the critical components of a cybersecurity public relations program, and then how to educate executives on the public relations program and set realistic expectations and goals. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our professors for today. We're joined by Tony Welz, who's principal and founder of W2 Communications, who brings more than 20 years of experience in both corporate communications and agency-based technology marketing comms. And Joyson Cherian, who's a senior vice president at W2 Communications, who also brings more than 15 years of experience in developing strategic programs for clients in the cybersecurity space. I'm so excited. This is going to be a super fun and interactive session. We encourage you to use the chat for questions, and we also encourage you to unmute and ask your questions live to the professors. There will be Q&A at the end, but they want you to engage throughout the entire session, so don't be afraid to unmute and ask questions. And yeah, I'll give the mic over to our W2 friends if you want to do a quick introduction about yourselves, and let's dive right in.
Sure. I'll actually kick it off, and actually, Marie, if you want to jump into the next slide, we pulled together this quick agenda, and we appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all. I mean, if we're looking at the modern cybersecurity public relations and how to execute a program successfully, and all the components to think about, honestly, 1 hour is clearly not enough, and hence the 3 sessions that we're doing. But the way that we thought about this when we put together this deck is we want to look at several scenarios. What's in today's session is the planning approach. What do you need to think about before you embark on this program? What are the questions you need to ask? What should you know about the world and the market? And then the next session will focus on how to execute on everything that you planned out and built towards. And then a final session on just as important. It's not just about the outreach and the relationships and the placements that you get, but how do you amplify that work, and how do you build on that success to grow for your audience further and grow your engagement even further. But just for today, we are going to focus on the planning side, background side, how to look at a program and how to approach it most effectively to begin with. And so, today's agenda, we look more at, we want to give you insight on the state of the world. We want leading into what your strategy should be, and the questions that you should ask as an organization, as well as how to evaluate the right partners to sort of build out effective cybersecurity programs accordingly. But before we get into all the nitty-gritty, I figured it probably makes most sense to introduce ourselves a little bit. Maria, appreciate the quick heads up, but I'll actually turn it over to Tony to give you a little background on him.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tony Welz. As stated already, I'm one of the principals here at W2 Communications. I've been working with cybersecurity companies for well over 20 years, helping with their branding efforts, awareness, credibility programs, things that really try to set our clients apart. And what you're going to hear from Joyson and I today are really things that we try to work with our clients on when we're starting a program. What do they need to be thinking about? Where do they need to be focused? And how can we maximize their investment? Whether it's by industry standards a huge investment, or by their standards a huge investment. We always want to make sure that people are getting the right return on what they're putting in, and we want to make sure that we're delivering that. So that's really where this program comes from today.
Yep, and I've been working with Tony for a little over 14 years now, on the marketing and PR side of things, with a lot of our cybersecurity clients, but across the board as well. And I think there are components that resonate not just in the cybersecurity industry, but across a variety of technology sectors, and what makes a successful PR campaign and PR programs and media relationships and activities. And we hope to share with you this afternoon a lot of what we've learned along the way, and a lot of indicate a lot of the questions that we often find ourselves answering on a repeated basis. And that actually begins with the next slide, where part of your PR professional's job is really understanding the landscape, understanding the state of the media, the state of the world, and what resonates and what drives interest, and what drives a willingness for a target reporter, whether they are a business, in trade, or even much more technical audiences, to want to speak with an organization. And that begins with what the state of the market is right now. Actually, you want to jump into the next slide? The key thing to realize here is the market's changed quite a bit. And what reporters and publications are looking for are being dictated differently than they were 10 years ago. Tony?
Yeah, and I'd say, one of the things we challenge our team with is on a pretty regular basis, kind of doing an audit of what the media looks like. Because even on an annual basis, especially if you look at the last 12 months, what the media is interested in, where they're focused, what they're doing has changed greatly. But even if you look back 5 years, 10 years, it's, 10 years ago, you could still get product reviews. There was a lot of product coverage. These days, it's a lot less. And it's so that we want to make sure that we're really tuned into what they're looking at. There's fewer reporters out there. Now, cyber is one of those areas where they keep investing in more reporters in different areas. It's a more diversified landscape, but the actual overall number is smaller, and what they're focused on is very different. There's a lot of focus on breaking news, a lot of focus on the breach of the day, the vulnerability. There's very little focus on what the defenders are doing, and only in those cases, really, for the most part, when it's in relation to what the attack was. So focusing on what the offensive action was, and then they'll focus on the defensive. And those are things that we try to keep in mind as we're building out storylines. There's that wider audience, as this says, for covering cybersecurity. But again, it's diversified, and we're seeing microsites, smaller publications, one-off publications popping up, which we're educating our clients on. A few years ago, there was a very small publication here in DC, and there was a really smart reporter that worked there. And we had to convince our clients, hey, he's smart, you should want to talk to him. Some of them took our advice, some of them didn't. And it turns out he's now one of the key guys over at Reuters. So it's building those relationships early, understanding that those smaller sites really do bring a lot of value to the table. They're thirsty for not just that breaking news, but the data and the statistics and the research that goes into it. One of the things we talked about with our clients a lot is, how can we work with your research team? What are they doing? Do you have a research team, or are there insights that you're seeing? You obviously are, that other people can't offer. Let's try to bring those to the forefront. I think I mentioned this earlier, but breach news, definitely is eclipsing, product news, company news. There's places for that, your website, social, other things, and there's a balance there. But the story angles that the reporters are interested in, we want to make sure we're tying into that, and then bringing in our corporate messaging, bringing in our client to talk about something, but then leveraging that to also talk about themselves. And that's what a smart PR person is doing these days, leveraging those outside opportunities to bring in the client to not just address what the reporter wants to talk about, but what they want to talk about. I think the thing to keep in mind is breach news is great. We see it every day. SolarWinds has been in the headlines now for almost 2 months. But there's also and especially that we see this come more from executive leadership who don't pay as close attention and shouldn't pay as close attention to the PR and media landscape. But there's this thirst to, hey, that news broke, we need to chase it. And SolarWinds is a great example. Within 24 hours of the SolarWinds news, we saw all over social media, top reporters, basically the backlash against PR people and businesses that were trying to chase that news without really anything insightful to say was really kind of damning for a lot of folks. And it's figuring out what you need your tone to be and figuring out when it's appropriate to jump into those news cycles and when it's better to take a back seat. And our counsel is a little more conservative than some, is it's always better to take a breath before we jump in. Let's evaluate the situation. Let's not just jump in. And sometimes that means you miss out on day one, maybe, but day two is always more valuable anyway. And then the last thing is, and this comes down to like relationship building and the opportunities that we want to see with reporters, which is, offering them exclusives, bringing them insights, information, data that they can't get anywhere else, and that you're not shopping to every one of their peers, but that and you're acknowledging they're an important part of your ecosystem, and they're as important to you as you are to them, or at least that's the goal. And you do that. We do that by basically bringing them into the fold and saying, okay, what's interesting to you? What can we give you as an exclusive that would be valuable to your readers? Joyson, did I miss anything?
Yeah, I think there's the one interesting component of that is you look at the evolution of the definition of event-driven coverage. 10 years ago, you could argue, there's a conference coming up. Reporters will be interested in covering any news, product updates, company updates that are revolved or announced around that event or conference. But with fewer reporters, fewer specialized reporters whose attentions are divided, event-driven coverage is the events have changed. The event is the breach that's discovered. The event is the data that's released. The event is not an external conference that's going on in the industry. The event is what the vendor is delivering to the market to show evolution and show emerging threats in the market. But when we look at what the reporters are actually looking for, we can jump into the next slide. There are a variety of components that makes for successful storytelling. From first and foremost standpoint, we know what news cycles are. If you've been paying attention to social media over the last week, let alone the last month or year, you know that timeliness is a huge factor. And what is prominent today will not be prominent tomorrow. And so timeliness is it continues to be a critical component of what drives media interest. What is changing? What is new? What is capturing attention? What is the impact to broader audiences? As Tony mentioned earlier, the proliferation of attacks against consumer audiences and the ability of threats or research to affect a wide swath of people, that draws attention of media as well. And also, you want to look at the different components such as conflict. What is out of the norm that we're providing to reporters that they may not be expecting. And that ties into the surprise component of things as well. What has the market been saying for years that where we can deliver research or findings that say, that's incorrect. Things are changing, things are evolving, and here's how. And there are various components that we can outline accordingly. Tony?
Yeah, I think the other thing to think about as we look at this slide is, not only what drives coverage, but what inhibits coverage. And I think we saw a lot of that in 2020 as well. There were news cycles that just crushed, the opportunity to gain coverage and to have conversations. There were weeks on end where we were guiding our clients and saying, it doesn't make sense to try to have a conversation right now. But more importantly, what inhibits coverage? We work with a very cynical media. So we need to think in terms of they're going to see a product announcement or company news as just that. Okay, you're trying to feed me your storyline. rather than trying to talk to me about what my audiences are interested in. And that's a really important nuance. And I think, that ties into a lot of what Joyson went through. But when you think of it in those terms, what's going to inhibit them from covering you? I think that opens up a world of opportunity to really think creatively about how do I eliminate those obstacles, those sometimes artificial obstacles that may be put in my way, that I can basically leverage to actually grow my coverage and grow my reporter relationships, as opposed to having those singular outputs, if you will. And I think that, sorry, Joyson, one more thing before we move on. I think also it's, to that end, figuring out how to deliver value versus feeding into or getting buried by the noise. And I think that's an important thing too. Again, going more targeted, more narrow, growing the relationship, being more organic, as opposed to just trying to shout into a crowded room, right? Finding those relationships and those conversations that are really going to provide value to yourself, to your organization, and to your customers or the audiences you're trying to reach.
So Tony, to that point exactly, I think Jana had a question in the chat. How conflicting can you get? What's your litmus test? That's not a question, that I could answer for another vendor, because it really depends on what's the opinion you want to take. You have to determine internally where, do you want to pick a fight with a competitor? Is there false information out in the market? And what value is there to you to try to take that on and be overly conflicting? I think it has to be, in general, a measured approach. And that comes in conversations with your executive team. It comes in conversations with your sales team. And it also comes in conversations with your PR partners, because they'll have an indication of what the media landscape is looking for and what may backfire if you go too aggressive.
Yep. I think one of the phrases we use here is poking the bear. And I personally love it. If there's an incumbent in your space and there's a way to basically poke them to draw attention to you, that's great, but you need to do it with the right tone. We had a client a few years ago who they issued, Symantec actually was one of their target competitors. They issued a report that actually, if you dug into the data, made a case for this competitor as opposed to the Symantec solution. And they used that on social to engage. And, it was an interesting case study to watch, because the Symantec folks actually engaged them. Their website traffic and their social following grew by 300% overnight based on doing that. It was a very thought out thing. We didn't expect that kind of return on that investment, but it's an interesting way to go. But you do have to figure out, how far do I want to push it and what makes sense for my business? And again, you don't want to be so conflicting that you're alienating people.
There's an analogy that I frequently use, and it comes to the thought of nuance. There's a difference between hammering a rock and breaking it versus using a chisel and sculpting something out of it. And I think you want to take an approach where you're sculpting the story that's more valuable to you instead of breaking rocks that will cause you headaches later on. And actually, we're going to jump into the next slide. Now, in terms of the media motivations and what they're looking for, obviously they want to deliver a story that is compelling and has useful information to their readers. They want to deliver reliable sources of information, and they want good visuals and sound bites. But at the end of the day, they want reader engagement, and that reader engagement happens with sharing the story, liking the story, promoting, having readers promote that story and comment and be a part of the storytelling component. But that only happens when you deliver information to the reader that is compelling to them, and that's something that the reader wants to engage with. And a really, while there's data points and experts to deliver, a really an emerging component is the visuals. What can we deliver from a graphics, video, GIF standpoint that makes it something that people will want to watch, view, and share to their internal audiences as well. Tony?
Yeah, I think the one other piece here is, these are motivations for a lot of our reporters and folks that we're dealing with. The other thing to remember is every reporter has not only an editor, but a publisher. And the publisher is chasing clicks, right? They want people to click on the story. So it needs to be compelling, it needs to be interesting, but it also needs to tie into the news cycles that they see getting the most attention. And that's where, we are constantly working with our clients to say, okay, let's sculpt this narrative. Okay, what's the lead to this narrative what's gonna get us to this conversation, but also give them that compelling draw that's gonna bring in the reader.
Can I ask a question? Sorry, I'm just like jumping in and unmuting. Can I ask a question about Joyson, what you said about graphics and visuals? Can you elaborate more on that? Because, now in this like social media landscape and everything, like I feel like and now that we're all digital, I feel like graphics are more important than ever. But can you explain the use of graphics and how it relates to getting a reporter to be interested in the story you have to share?
Sure. It all goes back to the measurement point that we brought up a moment ago. And if you look simply at social media activity, if you are to post something with an image in your tweet, that's going to get significantly more engagement. Same thing with a reporter who's trying to do an article that asks for a infographic, a video, or even an audio snippet. Recently, I got asked for an audio snippet for a reporter to use in an article as well. And so what are components that make a reader want to engage in that story? Will they click on that graphic? Will they play the video? Will they share it accordingly? All of those are components that are much more stimulating than text alone. And so what can you deliver to give a reporter all the assets they need to make as engaging a story as possible?
Great. And before we move on, Joyson, do we have a question in the chat about examples of the right tone when poking the grizzly bear or poking the bear? To kind of address that, we've got a client right now who has an incumbent that's entering their space. And from a sales standpoint, they're actually very concerned about it. From a marketing standpoint, they have a position of power coming to it. But part of our counsel to them is we can't just attack that vendor. We can't just go after them with emotional FUD, if you will. It needs to be, when you're doing something like this, it needs to be fact-based. It needs to be educational. If not, it ends up turning into noise. It turns up getting written off as, okay, that's just marketing collateral. It's, you guys are saying it to defend your turf, but what's behind it? So really, I think the big thing about the tone of a poking the bear is you need to have the assets in place. You need to have the data points. You need to be educational. You can't just say, just attack them for the sake of attacking them. You need to have that basis there. I think that's the key.
Cool. Before we move on into sort of your media program, the one additional component that just dawned on me is when you think about multimedia content, think about how people digest it and what gets digested most quickly. A reason that Instagram has emerged in popularity so much is you're just looking at a picture. You're just looking at a quick snippet video. It allows you to digest content in a much quicker manner. And so that's exactly why all of that resonates in social media platforms. And then the same thing in articles. They're looking for multimedia assets and content that will tell the story in a more effective way while keeping you engaged in the narrative. Now, obviously we talked about the state of the world, but then it comes into your own media program and what to think about when building out your media strategy. And at the beginning of anything, there's a lot of times people want a media strategy solely to get attention and solely to get eyes on the organization, and that a lot of times that request comes down from senior leadership. But if we jump to the next slide, there's a lot of questions that need to be asked. And if you're not looking at a PR media program strategically, you run the risk of simply chasing noise instead of making news. And in a market where there's thousands of competitors, and if you go to the RSA conference or something, and there's several exhibit halls at this point of companies trying to make a name for themselves, you're going to get buried. And it makes sense to ask the right questions to build out an effective program that you can continue to build momentum on top of. And there's several questions throughout this. If you want to jump into the first one. The first is the most basic question to understand. Who is your target audience? Who are you trying to reach, and what's the story you want to tell them? There's a different story for VCs if you're looking to get funding versus customers versus an executive, larger organizations if you're looking to get acquired too. So you need to figure out what's the audience you want to target so you can tailor your messaging towards those audiences accordingly. Tony?
And I think one of the things we see a lot is, when people don't really sit down and aren't honest with themselves about what the audience they want to attack is. We need to grow sales. We need to get in front of the buyer. We need to influence the sales funnel. But yet I want broadcast or I want business press, and that may not be the right vehicle to get in front of those buyers. Is a sysadmin or a security practitioner really watching CNBC at noon on a Wednesday? Probably not, right? So where should we be going with that story? And this is where it also is important to involve all senior leadership, potentially up to the board and the VCs as well, to make sure everybody is on board with what that, because this informs the rest of the strategy. Is everybody on board with that strategy?
To Tony's point, getting a placement in the Wall Street Journal isn't going to lead to a deluge of leads at your front door. You also need to build relationships with in-depth technical publications, because a lot of those readers may be the end users of your product, and you need to build relationships with them so they can be internal advocates for you as you move up to those broader visibility publications as well. So after you've identified your audience, the next key component to determine is, what are the storylines you want to tell? What are your key differentiators? At the end of the day, it's great to have data points and findings and insights that you want to tell to the market, but there has to be a reason for that. There has to be a messaging exercises behind that, so that you know that coming out of your media activities, you want your key audiences to say, oh, okay, I know X vendor because they do ABC 1, 2, 3. You need to define what those 1, 2, 3s are and those ABCs are. So those become your core messaging platforms that people come to you for. And that's not just part of your media program. That's there to amplify your marketing initiatives as well. Tony?
Yeah, and I think the important part of this slide is, the last word, differentiators. And I think the key there also is to take that in context with the previous slide, the audience, because each audience is a different differentiator, could be important to each of those audiences. The differentiators for your VCs or investors, potential investors or partners, it could be very different than the differentiator of the person that's actually using the product. To the person using the product, you could have the best detection in the world, but if I can't use it, if it's not usable, then and your competitors aren't usable, I want a usability message, right? So I mean, that's kind of distilling it down and making it a little bit too simple, but there are key things that you need to consider in that context. And to add to that, that's where outside counsel, especially say a PR firm, marketing firm, or partners in the industry outside of the company that have that expertise and that knowledge across the board within the industry can help. Because some things that you may think is a differentiator or is really going to set you apart, somebody that's looking from the outside in may look at and go, actually, that story is being told, but you hit on something else. This isn't.
Now, one of the next question really focuses on a interesting component. What resources do you have available? And before you even get to the resource component of things, one thing I want to bring up is the idea of interest and interesting. I've been in quite a few conversations with customers, prospects over the years, and I say, what makes you different? What makes you interesting? What makes you great? And they say, it's our technology. Okay, every other vendor is going to say their technology. Well, what else makes you different or what makes you great? It's our people. We have the best people. Again, I've heard that's the answer that everyone's going to say. And so you have to do a measured reflection into the organization of what unique assets do you have available, and the resources that are available to support your media program. Those resources can come from a variety of sectors. It could be you have research analysts that have in-depth views into the cybersecurity landscape and threats that others don't. It could be thought leaders, internal SMEs that have expertise and a background and experiences that many others don't. And it could be simply the sheer amount of data that you have access to that reporters can cull for their personal info, for their reporting and details. And so what resources do you have internally that you can reflect out? And a lot of times it starts from that thought leadership aspect. It really is talking to some of the smartest people in your organization, your CTOs or your CEOs, your engineers, and talking to them and finding out, all right, in the market, what are the challenges you're seeing? What are the problems that customers are facing? Talking to your sales leads and asking them, what are our most frequently asked questions from prospects? How do we build storylines around the concerns that are being vocalized to us? And you may think you don't have the resources available, but it simply starts with the conversations of who you're targeting and what the stories that they're telling that allows you to build out those resources accordingly.
I usually start by basically, when I start with a new company, I put together my list of what are the assets I want or I think we're going to need. And then I start asking questions about what assets we have. And I try to map those things. Sometimes I'm surprised. We have assets that I didn't expect or weren't on my list. Other times it's looking at the assets and going, okay, now how do we differentiate them? How do we sculpt, to use Joyson's analogy from earlier, how do we sculpt them into something that's going to set us apart? But starting there and then asking questions and doing that audit really is helpful.
Before we move on, I think, Gianni, you had a question about tying the PR program with an influencer program. Did you want to have anything specific about that? Or do you want us to sort of dive in?
Sorry, I have to find my unmute. Yeah, I'm just, we, in our group in the society, we have a very active influencer and social channel where, we're seeing all these cybersecurity companies start to create influencers where literally your job at the company in like the marketing department or, a customer facing / like promotional role is to be someone who's like fairly technical, but an influencer for the company. So I'm just wondering about like, I don't know, I'd actually just like to hear any of you guys' thoughts on that and how it ties into PR, because like you're saying, assets on the team, like having technical assets or people who you guys could talk to. Now I'm kind of rambling, but I'd just be curious about what you think.
Sure. When I think of the word influencer, the first thing that comes to mind is, today's influencer was yesterday's thought leader. And one of the phrases that gets said around our agency a lot is thought leaders need to have thoughts. And the same thing comes to the influencer community. What are you doing to position yourself as a thought leader or an influencer? And that first thing you're doing is engaging, putting your opinions out there, having your insights shared, and having conversations accordingly. One of the things we mentioned much earlier up is how the media landscape has changed. Another thing that's happened is there are multiple opportunities to contribute content and contribute articles. And that's a great first step in becoming a thought leader influencer, getting your opinion out there, but not just getting it posted. Once it's posted, how are you sharing it in your social channels and engaging with other influencers to position yourself as a resource in the market? It doesn't happen magically overnight. It comes from actual activity and engagement and going back and forth with everyone as necessary.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we do when we first start with a new client is we interview their executives, and not just the top executives, but also, everybody down to researchers and SEs, and we basically want to get their thoughts. And we'll put together actual, what we dub playbooks, where we say, hey, this person has an interesting perspective here, while this one has an interesting perspective here, these things can help support different initiatives within the company, and we can use them and we can leverage them different ways. And that way we're harnessing all these different perspectives to help drive the company narrative.
Perfect. And I think we've got a couple more questions to ask. Want to move on to the next slide. Now, this is one of the most difficult, is level setting expectations. And it's hard, it's difficult, but it also starts with transparency and educating your senior leadership accordingly. Tony, you want to chime in here?
Yeah, I think, you know, a couple of the challenges, especially in the last, say, 5 years in cybersecurity. One, what used to be a very insular industry has expanded greatly. So we have people that are coming into it that haven't been in cyber before and are coming in with maybe some preconceived notions that may or may not be accurate. And then we also, because of the rapid change that's happened within the media landscape, we also have executives that believe they know the right path forward, believe they know the strategy that worked for me at X company 10 years ago is going to work again today. And it really is sitting down with them and taking the time to lay out the media landscape, lay out what you want to do as a company, and then how the PR program can achieve those goals. But it is that expectation setting, that level setting, and it does start with the conversations about the questions that we asked before. Who's our target audience? How do we differentiate ourselves? What's the story we want to tell? And what are our assets? What we find a lot of times is, you know, the story we want to tell doesn't align with the assets we have. So how can we tell that story? What can we do differently that helps us tell that story without those assets? Or do we need to pull back on that story a little bit and tell it differently? But that's part of that give and take that has to happen. Again, because we have people coming in with limited knowledge of what it takes to really do PR and marketing within this industry these days, especially, again, as I mentioned earlier, with the level of cynicism that we have coming at us from the reporter community.
And then we come to the notion of measuring success. And Tony, and we'll also tell you that, you know, it can be a failing game to go simply purely by number of hits and number of placements, because you're then just perpetually chasing a certain number instead of building on a program that encourages the expanded growth of your organization, extended reputation building of your PR program. Tony? Yeah.
True story. We had a client about 5 years ago that we signed on with them, and it was a red flag on day one when we met with their executives, and they said, your metric for our first quarter is 90 hits in the first quarter. So we basically said, okay, so in 90 days, you want 90 stories. And this wasn't, we want a syndicated mention, but we actually want really unique stories within 90 of them within 90 days. And you know, that's kind of an absurd, when you step back and think about it as a PR person, it's an absurd metric, but it's also, it's representative of, you know, it illustrates a bigger point, which is, you know, to Joyson's point, just measuring on number isn't going to get you where you want to go. Share of voice, obviously a popular way to look at things these days. If you're measuring share of voice properly, if you're really dissecting it and say, look, in the cybersecurity community, I'm never going to have 100% share of voice. I'm barely going to have 10% share of voice, even if I'm one of the big guys. But in my market segment, I want to have X% of share of voice and I want to see it grow. That's a realistic way to look at it. Looking at it in terms of, look, I know my buyers are in this community. I want to focus my coverage in this area. I'm not going to pay attention to the bigger stuff. I want quality hits in these couple of places. That's a good way to look at it. So again, it's about education. It's about really digging into what's going to be valuable to our business. 90 hits that don't make sense, that, you know, great, you got a bunch of one-line mentions in second and third tier blogs that nobody's reading. That's not going to be helpful to you. What is going to be helpful, and really diving into that. So
Tony touched on an important word there. And as you look at educating and speak and making senior leadership expectations realistic, as well as measurement. This is a really important opportunity to educate. There's been plenty of times where we've had a client or senior CEO at a client reach out and say, hey, our competitor was in this Bloomberg article. How come we're not in Bloomberg? And so let's take a moment to dissect that. In that article, the competitor delivered a customer or two to the reporter for them to speak to, and they delivered unique, compelling research that for Bloomberg's audiences affects consumers. What do we have in that realm that can do the same? Who are the customers that we can bring to the table for conversations? What is the unique research and data points that we can find? And that customer conversation can't simply be, oh man, let me tell you how great things are because we worked with X vendor. It has to be, these were the problems, these were the challenges, and it caused a disruption in our business. And as a result, we were able to fix it by working with this organization, but it's not going to be a case study in how great your company was.
And proactively, we work with our clients a lot. We actually had a client over the holidays who they had a competitor that appeared on CNBC. CEO came to them and said, you know, this is the type of stuff we want. You know, we need to focus on this. Based on conversations that we had had with the CMO and the head of corporate communications before that, they said, you're right, we do. Here's our plan for getting there. Here's what we're putting in place. We're getting customers, we're getting this, we're getting that. Now let's dissect what the competitor did. They were there, they were talking about solar winds, they were pontificating about stuff and theorizing about things that we never want to touch. The tone of this competitor's approach is totally averse to what we want to do. It's not the way we want to present ourselves, so we would never go after that story. CEO came back and said, okay, that makes sense. That's the right strategy for this company. You're right. It's making sure that we're in front of those conversations before we get asked also, making sure that and it comes down to, and I don't know if we hit on this earlier, but really the tone of the company. How do we want to position ourselves? You know, it's easy to get people to notice you if you're screaming at the top of your lungs, but is that the right attention? And is it going to backfire on you at some point? And the conversation we had with this client was, yeah, that type of coverage for that competitor in the sales calls we're in, that conversation is going to backfire on them.
And I think Stephanie just had a really interesting question of how do you, let me make sure I have it correctly. What are some realistic measurements of success one can reach for? I think you can consistently build coverage and build a component of a program based on consistent activity and outreach. And like I mentioned earlier, I think you can start from a foundational standpoint of contributed articles. Let's get your name out there. Let's get your input and insights out there. Candidly, let's make you Googleable. At the end of the day, when there's going to be plenty of times in your program where we're going to reach out, offer an expert, and the reporter will Google that expert to see what they've said before. And it is really helpful to chart that, have a set of articles that you've placed in the past, contributed articles, set of opinions that you've written in the past. So it's and not just articles that are placed in some of your target publications, but where's content that you're placing in social media channels as well. So you're building a footprint of your knowledge accordingly. And then from there, you can build on top of that for additional coverage.
I think one of the keys there too is when you're looking at measuring success is it's really hard on January 1st of 2021 to say our metric for success is X number of features in these types of publications and laying it out like that. A better way to think about it is based on campaigns and assets. What do we want the success to look like? What does the campaign look like? What are we trying to accomplish here? And let's map our success to that campaign. And because with that, you'll know what your assets are. You'll know who your targets are, and you should know or have a basis for what's attainable. And always trying to surpass what you view as attainable is always kind of a good way to go about, obviously, because then hopefully you've got better metrics at the end of the year. We always try to take a campaign approach with our clients where, 3 to 4 campaigns a year on a quarterly basis where we're focusing in on key areas. And then the next question from there was, what's the right tone for a startup? It really depends on the executive leadership. It kind of depends on what space you're in. I think the one pitfall sometimes of early stage companies and the tone they take is trying to be too controversial or adversarial out of the gate, which actually hurts credibility. I think early on, credibility is really your most important asset. It's building that credibility. So making sure you're educational. It's okay to be a little controversial, be contrarian, but do it in a way that is defensible as well. The moment you become indefensible, you start losing credibility, and your share of voice and your influence over the reporter and the media and others is going to diminish.
And then one of the more recent questions that was just asked is, the right type of social interaction for a company to take after published byline or media query. And I don't want to step on the toes of my colleagues who'll speak in a couple of weeks. That's why we have an entire class dedicated to sort of amplifying that story. But in short, it's not simply just posting the article or published byline. It's how do you engage? Let's say it was a media interview that you engaged with. The article posted. Are you following that reporter accordingly? Are you engaging with that reporter and adding additional commentary when the reporter posts that story in their social channels? Are you sharing and tagging that reporter in your social channels to show them that you're helping them build the audience? There are a variety of things that can be done to, again, amplify your presence in that story and amplify your presence in the successful media placements. And I don't want to oh, go ahead, Tony.
Oh, I was going to loop back to, I think, the other one about getting silence from media and from the editorial side. I think really, and we do this actually a lot when we have a new client as well. It's just as important to ask questions of the media as it is to try to present your stance or your opinions. So a lot of times when we're starting a new campaign, when we're starting a new client, or if there's just a new reporter that we've identified, the first step is reaching out to them and introducing ourselves and saying, I want to introduce myself. Here's who I am. Here's what I do. Here's who I'm working with. And I'd like to understand from you what you're interested in. Obviously, reading their stuff and understanding that before you get to that point is important as well. But it's that engagement. And I think even on the PR agency side, people lose that sometimes. It's not a one-way conversation. It's not, I want to push information at you just so that you'll cover me. Our stance is, it's a dialogue. It's I've read what you're writing. I think what I have to offer you is interesting to your audiences, and here's why. Let's talk about it. And that engagement is more important than anything else. And some reporters are harder to nail down with that engagement, but there are a lot out there that will respect that and will engage. It still doesn't guarantee coverage, but at least you'll have that level of understanding with them.
There's an anecdote that I'll share, and it really ties in. There's a question that was asked about ideal balance between exec-oriented and tech-oriented info. It really depends on who you're talking to and personalizing that conversation to that individual. On one hand, I had a conversation with a client recently where they asked for guidance on which executive should speak to a media opportunity we brought to the table. And I advocated for one executive over another because this conversation necessitated a higher level approach. And so it really comes from understanding who that reporter is, their beat, their areas of focus, and how granular or high level they want the conversation to go. And personalizing the input that you're delivering to the reporter accordingly. And when it comes to personalizing input, there was a pitch that I made a long time ago to a high-level business reporter that I had worked with for years, and although I hadn't connected with him for a while. And I reached out and I said, hey, listen, I wanted to follow up on something that you told me 10 years ago when we met at the RSA conference. And he responded back quickly saying, wow, I can't believe it's been 10 years. You're a senior VP now, I'm getting old. We went back and forth on that for like a couple minutes, and he responded and he resonated and the relationship was built because I was referencing a personal experience and I tied that specifically to him. I didn't send him some broad brush pitch that I sent to 10 other folks. And it's difficult and it takes time to build those relationships accordingly. And that's why, if you jump into the next slide, I advocate the notion that you can't do it alone. Everything that Tony and I outlined during this session, as well as the upcoming session, shows that there's a lot of information that needs to be explored and understood. And that's why we advocate, we recommend at times, depending on what scope that you're looking for a PR partner that can help provide the insight and guidance to build out a successful media program that adheres to your goals, but also helps answer the questions that we outlined previously. And when you're looking for that partner, I think you have to look for several components. One, creativity. Two, the relationships that they have and the reported trust that they may have already, as well as the ability to execute. And I think creativity, to begin with, before I turn it over to Tony, is a really important concept, especially after the year that we've had. We've had a lot of conversations with our clients, as well as our friends in the media as well, of the word of 2020 and what's quickly becoming the word of 21, the ability to pivot. And so when you have so many external changes and activities that are going on, how can you creatively pivot and change your storylines to address to the concerns and the interests of the media? And you will know that and know how to pivot based on the relationships that you've built. And after you've creatively adjusted and you've relied on the existing relationships, then you can see the execution that comes as a result of additional coverage and opportunities that your competitors may not be facing. Tony?
Yeah, and I think a couple of things to add here. I think one, the slide previous, you can't do it alone. I think you can't do it alone forever, right? There, at a certain point, when you're starting out, I think a lot of organizations, you need to go it alone. But it's when do you hit that point where you need to scale, when it needs to grow, and when you need that external input. And I think that's one of the key things to look for in a partner as well is, do they have the context? Are they embedded in the tech community, the cyber community, the areas that you want to focus on? And can you give you that context? Can they give you those perspectives so that they can help filter out what's a differentiator from something that's basically everybody has, right? How can they filter out and have those, do they have those relationships? Do they have the ability to pick up the phone and basically say to a reporter, which is something that we do a lot as well, hey, I've got an idea. It may not be quite the right story yet, but here's what I'm thinking about. What do you think? And just the conversation I was having with an old reporter friend yesterday was exactly that. Hey, he basically said, I'm thinking about this. And I said, well, I'm thinking about this. Came together as, now we've got an idea. Now there's actually potentially a story brewing. But do they have the ability to have those conversations? And that only comes from folks that are actually embedded in the community.
Cool. And then when you think about how to have a successful partnership with your PR partner, I think the number one thing that we tell our clients is treat us as an extension of your company, not as an external partner. We're not tax attorneys. You can't give us your receipts and your W-2 and say, go off and run with it and let me know when my taxes are done. We want to know a lot of the why and the what's going on. What's the feedback you're hearing? What are the insights that you're gleaning? You're internally gleaning, and also what are the concerns that you're hearing from customers as well as senior leadership? So let us help you adjust the program along the way and take a proactive stance instead versus a reactive stance. We want to be an advocate for you that's strategic versus a Band-Aid that's rushing to solve every hole that maybe that has a leak. Tony, was there anything you wanted to add?
Nope.
Perfect. Well, and as we said in sort of summary, there are several components here. One, know your audience. obviously be prepared and ask the right questions. Stay in control. Understand where your storylines are, where your messages are going to stay, and don't go outside of those borders. And as we just indicated, let your PR team and PR agency help you, especially with the knowledge that's going on externally and how they can be a resource to help sculpt and point you in the right direction for your media strategies and media approaches. And with that, we're at the top of the hour. We have room for some questions if anyone had any additional feedback.
I have a quick question. So let's say, this is Stephanie Pasamonte. Let's say you're about to have a kickoff call with a new PR firm, a partner that you've just signed on with. What are the best things that you can sort of bring to that meeting to make it as productive as you can? And what are things that that PR partner is going to be looking for?
Yeah, a lot of times we'll start those meetings. We actually come in with a complete agenda, and a lot of that has to do with different things we want. So, you know, we ask, you know, who are your key spokespeople and what are they passionate about? Where is your sales team succeeding and where are they losing? Where are they having trouble? Because that's actually really insightful into what the types of obstacles we may hit when we start pitching you to the media, right? So, and they're also the things that we may need to help overcome through the media program. So those are two key areas. I think also, you know, obviously the assets that you have, technology roadmap, and how it stacks up against your competitors is always helpful. I think the worst situation I've been in as a PR person is to go out and actually try to pitch a new client, have a conversation. I put forth something and have a reporter come back and say, that's not true, Tony. This is what I've been told by them in the past, or this is what that competitor is doing. And so being and acknowledge your PR firm is under NDA. We're not going to share your deep dark secrets, but we need to know what's really going on so that we can portray you in the best light, and so that we have answers when we get the hard questions.
To Tony's point, there's never been a point where I've had a kickoff meeting with a new client and they've given us too much information. You know, whatever you can share helps inform the program, all the way down to granular white papers and product slicks, to insight into what's coming down in the research pipeline, to and just as important, existing media relationships. You know, who have they worked with in the past, and who have they felt uncomfortable working with in the past. And so, you know, anything that you should feel comfortable sharing, you should share, because it helps inform the program both in the long and short term.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Anyone else?
We did have a question about pivots last year, and I think there are a couple of examples that we can lay out. You know, we had one client who played in the managed detection and response space. And as the year went on, they were actually getting great coverage and great feedback on what they were doing. But what we looked at was, you know, especially as in-person events went away and other lead generation went away, we actually pivoted a lot of their program to a paid social program. They had already had the PR piece in place, and we were able to keep moving on that. But we were able to leverage paid social to actually increase their lead gen. And where they would have seen it in other areas last year, they were able to move that in that direction. So that may not be a specific PR example. It is a way of keeping their name out there. Their name was still top of mind with their key buyers, and it helped them with the lead, with generating leads and continuing to grow their business actually throughout the year, which was a big move for them. We had another client that was in the process of doing a rebrand right as the quarantine started. So I think our launch for them was supposed to be like March 20th or something. So right as everybody was going into lockdown, and we had to put a pause on that program, reevaluate it, and say, and they were going to launch it with this new initiative with a bunch of in-person events around the country. we repositioned it and said, okay, now we're going to take all that content, we're going to turn it into bylines, we're going to turn it into blogs, we're going to basically do a virtual press tour. And we actually help them not only reposition, but actually be recognized from a share of voice perspective, and a few others as well, as a leader in that new space that they were moving into. So, but it meant taking a lot of the resources that were going to be used for live things and pivoting them over to virtual, to content and other things that they could leverage. So that was a big piece of last year. It was recognizing people are stuck at home, right? People are stuck not going to conferences. How can we maximize that? And especially at one of the conversations we're having with clients now, okay, great, everything's become virtual. Now everybody's got Zoom fatigue. So how do we overcome that? What do we do to move our programs so that we're not trying to just do the same thing we were doing in August?
And Tony, to your point, there's another example I think of where similar story. They switched their in-person event budget into virtual events and activities. But in this instance, they also identified when they planned a virtual event, they gave a exclusive access or insight, early preview conversation to one of their target media targets. As a result, that led to an additional conversation that led to that client being a part of a separate podcast that delved further into the subject that was covered in the webinar. And so there's ways to build on your pivots to help support and extend your media program.
I have a question. Sorry, another one. And this is a little off of the, this topic of like building your story and everything, but I really hate awards. Sorry, like personally, and anyone who's been on a previous PR event with me knows that. How is there a way to do award submissions right? Do you guys have any opinions on that?
Tony, you want to take it?
Thanks. Personally, I kind of hate awards too, and I'm not sure there's a right way to do them. I think that there are certain awards that are entirely transparent. If you pay the entry fee, you win the award, right? And then there are others that are entirely behind the curtain, like SC Media, where they're really, I can't tell you from year to year what their criteria is and how they choose their winners. I can say, my gut on some of these is they're purely based on who they see out in the industry the most, right? So if you're Microsoft or Google or, Symantec, you're probably going to win an award. And if you're the smaller guys, it's much harder. So I don't know that there's an easy way to say you're going to draft a award submission to win. I would say the better awards, I shouldn't say best, but the better awards are the ones that are backed by a third party that's kind of credible. And the best thing to do there is at least build awareness within that. So if it's the SC Awards, at least build awareness amongst their editorial board, their editors, their writers. But you're right. I mean, the awards is always one that kind of dogs this industry, right? Every executive wants them, and they don't understand that half of them are pay to play, and the others some of them can be really good, but they're not all that transparent.
Go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to say, I think to add to what Tony's saying, it's also a matter of, because there's so many of them, you want to rationalize and prioritize which ones are most important to you, and not and I say that from an organizational standpoint, but also an executive leadership standpoint. And so, there's going to be times where our competitor won this award. Why didn't we go after it? And so that becomes a priority because you're going to see a head-to-head comparison at some point. And so you're going to have to find a way to not boil the ocean and chase everything, because you're not going to get value out of that, but do so in a way that indicates value to your senior leadership team.
Thank you.
I have one more. This is Anne. You mentioned share of voice before in terms of a good measurement of success and how you're trending. Is that something the PR agency does for an organization, or is there a way that I, for example, could sort that out myself and see what the where we are or where we could be?
Yeah, so there actually, it depends on our client whether we do it for them or they do it for themselves. There are a number of tools. TrendKite does it, Muckrack does it. Some are more sophisticated than others. No share of voice tool that I've seen is actually perfect. It still takes a decent amount of manual maintenance to eliminate a lot of the noise that makes it in there. All of them grab press releases, which really are not a good, I mean, just because your press release got picked up on the 90,000 sites that Business Wire sends it to, doesn't mean you actually build share of voice, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to kind of manually pull a lot of that out, but there are tools out there that can help you. Yeah, again, I mentioned TrendKite and Muckrack. Joyson probably knows a few others. And it depends on how much time you want to spend, how accurate you can get.
Yeah, I will say that if you don't have access to those tools, it's possible, but immensely difficult, especially when you have to rely on Google searches or what's posted on various vendor websites. It's very difficult to track. It's the tools that expedite the challenge a lot easier.
Thank you.
All right, Maria or Jana, was there anything else that you guys wanted us to close up with?
No, I think this was great. Thank you so much. I loved all the interaction on chat, all the questions. I'm so glad there's 2 more courses because I think a lot of us still have unanswered questions on some of the future topics we're going to be talking about. So, and then Gian, should I give it to you to do our little outro and then tell people what to expect for the next few courses?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks so much, everybody, for joining us today. So the next course will be on February 5th at 1 p.m. Eastern. And that one is going to be about executing your cybersecurity media relations strategy. So we'll cover, building media lists, like establishing and maintaining relationships and all this like really good juicy stuff. And we're so excited for W2 Communications to come back and teach that course, plus the 3rd one, which will be the week after. So thanks everybody for attending. Feel free to email us if you have any comments or feedback or questions, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thanks, W2 team.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Joyson. Thank you, Tony.
Bye.
Thank you, Christine. Bye.